What we have on our agenda today is a rich panel discussion on one of today's biggest challenges to economic development, which is firms' informality. Micro, small, and medium-sized firms are engines of economic growth and the creation of jobs globally. Yet, what we see from literature and evidence is that most of them remain informal due to legal and administrative barriers. In recent years, more countries have, across different parts of the world, have been tackling these barriers by introducing simplified legal forms and special tax regimes for entrepreneurs and micro, small, and medium firms to incentivize their formalization. For instance, we have seen in Africa the entrepreneur status, in Morocco the auto-entrepreneur, in Cabo Verde the rampe, in Brazil simples. But that's not only a trend in developing countries, even in developed countries like Germany, for instance, or even Austria. They have a draft law currently being revised in Parliament on simplified legal status. Our discussion today will highlight a recent Business Environment Working Group study on simplified legal statuses. It will take a closer look at the reforms that have introduced this legal form for businesses that is particularly tailored to the characteristics of micro and SMEs. These legal forms may either entail simplified business registration, streamlined and tailored tax requirements, and non-fiscal incentives to push these firms to formalize. These statuses are usually considered more attainable for smaller enterprises that would otherwise not consider formalization if this form was not available to them. Along with the findings from the study, we will be sharing two case studies, country case studies, that will highlight the lessons learned from the adoption of simplified legal statuses as pathways for formality. The first one is from Ecuador through the implementation of the Organic Law of Entrepreneurs and Innovations, which introduced the simplified stock company. And then the second one from Cabo Verde, which is the rampe regime for micro and small enterprises. Before we kick off the discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So we'll start our discussion with an intervention by Gabriel Ferraz, who will be going over the main findings of the study. Gabriel is a lawyer and a policy analyst with over 10 years of experience. He has worked extensively on public policy for SMEs, while also being a consultant for the UNDP and the World Bank. He holds a Bachelor of Law degree from UFV and an LLM degrees in business law and economics from the University of Rotterdam. Next, we'll hear from Paul Velasco, who will present a case study from Ecuador. Paul is a partner at Equity Abogados and lectures in the School of Law at San Francisco de Quito University. He holds an LLM in corporate law, which was awarded by the University College of London. His main areas of expertise are related to commercial and corporate law, corporate governance, and insolvency law. Since 2020, Paul has been involved in the modernization of the corporate and insolvency legislation in Ecuador and has advised the government of Ecuador on the SAS reform that we're going to hear about. He's the author of several articles on corporate governance and insolvency law. He is also the academic coordinator of the Ibero-American Institute for Law and Finance. And since 2002, he has been an external consultant for the World Bank. Finally, we will hear from Nelida Fortes, who will be presenting a case study from Cabo Verde. Nelida is a tax inspector and a specialist in Cabo Verdean taxation. She has been working for 12 years in tax administration in the country. During her professional experience, she worked, among others, on the special regime for micro and small enterprises, the rampe. She's an expert on tax and social security legislation. She holds a master's degree in taxation from Portugal with a master's dissertation on this specific special regime, where she analyzed the impact of the regime in terms of formalization of the economy. And then finally, once we hear from our three speakers, we'll open the discussion and we'll allow the panelists to answer the questions from the audience that are posted in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I turn first to Gabriel for the first presentation. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the DCED seminar on simplified enterprise forms and special legal status for business formalization. Next slide, please. So the DCED commissioned a study on legal reforms designed to support MSMEs to create incentives for these enterprises to transition to the formal economy in developing and emerging economies. Next slide, please. For this study, we chose 5 different case studies especially from Africa and Latin America. So we analyzed the different characteristics, incentives, and key challenges involving the Simples Nacional and MEI regimes in Brazil, the monotributo special legal status in Argentina, the simplified joint stock company, the SAS in Ecuador, the REMPE in Cabo Verde, and also the auto-entrepreneur regime in Morocco to analyze what were the key characteristics, what were the challenges, what were the available impact studies about these regimes. So next slide, please. Basically, we identified among those regimes some common features, so especially related to policy goals. So in most of the countries, formalizing informal business is an explicit policy goal. Promoting competitiveness and development, such as in the REMP case. Reducing transaction costs is another goal, for instance, for the SaaS model. Promoting social inclusion is also a common cited policy goal, such as in the MEI case. Also, increasing the culture of compliance is another policy goal that we discovered on the research, and for instance, in the monotributo case in Argentina. As Tanya mentioned, other common features of those regimes include facilitating business registration, and that comes in the form of the possibility of online business registration, streamlining business registry procedures, and other measures. On the tax dimension, we discovered that most of those regimes provide some tax incentives to facilitate tax compliance, such as a fixed tax, as a monotax, as they call. Another example is presumptive tax regimes that make it easier for entrepreneurs and their accountants to calculate the tax that is due to the tax administration. And besides these 2 most common features, we also discovered that many of them, such as the MEI, monotributo, and REMPE, added a social protection incentive to the regime to make formalization more attractive to entrepreneurs. And in the study, we tried to analyze also the evidence on how agricultural small enterprises were treated by policymakers, and I will talk a little bit about how initially the regimes were not created for such companies, but in the end they were modified to include those companies, and they also benefit from them. And finally, we took a look into other approaches to enhance the effectiveness of the simplified legal status, such as awareness campaigns, business development services, which is the case in Brazil, in Cabo Verde, for instance, and also intergovernmental cooperation to create one-stop shops to simplify tax procedures. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit about the impact studies. In absolute numbers, the impact was very positive for business formalization. For instance, Nowadays, more than 66% of new incorporated companies in Ecuador are constituted in the SAS form. In Cabo Verde, the number of business registration grew 4 times from 2016 to 2019. And in Brazil, more than 15 million micro entrepreneurs have formalized. In Argentina, more than 4 million entrepreneurs have registered as monotributistas. So this shows that the numbers are big. In terms of tax compliance, we also observed positive effects in the REMPE regime, where the number of tax declarations grew from 1,500 to more than 25,000 tax declarations from 2015 to 2019. We discovered that the simplest regime grew from 4% of total federal revenues to 8% of total federal revenues in Brazil. And we learned also that companies registered under the SAS form have collected more than 218,000 million, 208 million US dollars in taxes. So there is a significant component of these regimes that contribute to tax collection and tax compliance. Finally, for the impacts on social protection and the job market, we have seen that, for instance, the May regime contributed to increase the coverage rate for self-employed workers in Brazil from 33 to 41% since the inception of the regime. There's still a lot of work to be done, but the contribution was significant. SEBRAE, the Brazilian MSME agency, estimated that between 2017 and 2019, the simplest regime alone contributed to 1.6 million formal jobs in Brazil, while big and medium enterprise reduced the job posts in 300 employees, but the impacts on social security on the long term should not be overlooked, and governments and policymakers should pay attention to that. And we will discuss a little bit more on the next slide. Can you go to the next, please? Okay, so I think this is the most interesting part of the research report, which are the lessons learned. And I will briefly discuss the 6 main findings. So one key takeaway from the research report is that effectiveness and sustainability of the regimes is a very important aspect. So countries considering reforms or to introduce or to improve such regimes should take a special look on the long-term sustainability in every aspect, either the taxation aspects and calculate accurately the potential impact to tax expenditure, on the social protection aspect and the impacts of sustainability in the pension system on the long term. And I think important lessons to address this risk is to facilitate the transition from the simplified to the general regime, for instance, through the use of progressive taxation when creating the regime, aim to create a small gap between the special regime and the general regime to facilitate the transition of the companies when their revenues increase. And of course, having establishing clear objectives and measuring if the regimes are being effective to achieve the policy objectives. We have identified a few challenges, for instance, the misuse of simplified legal status, for instance, companies underreporting their revenues, splitting in between 2 legal entities to keep benefiting from the regime. So this is one issue policymakers should carefully evaluate and think about enforcement and compliance measures to avoid. Also, we have seen a strong trend of digitalization during the pandemic, and not all countries have broad access to digital services, broadband connection, and this should be another aspect to be considered when, for instance, creating online business registration procedures, online tax filing procedures, and other incentives. Next one, please. To increase compliance, countries have adopted different measures. So pre-filled tax returns are a promising trend, and with the use of e-invoicing and other tools that are compliant by design, the burden to calculate the correct tax and to fill the the tax forms is more or less transferred to the state, to the system that can help compliance. Of course, using data, the tax authorities can use data from invoicing, from credit card transactions to try to identify potential misuse of such regimes. Another interesting trend is that offering social benefits is a strong incentive for formalization. Qualitative research done in Brazil shows that this is the #1 reason that self-employed people chose to formalize as micro-entrepreneurs. So this should be considered to include such benefits into the regimes, to integrate it to the general social insurance schemes is very, very important. We know that the job market is undergoing through a lot of the transitions recently, and social protection is still an important part that needs to be addressed for self-employed workers, for self-entrepreneurs, and we think we found out that this can be an incentive to formalization in developing countries. Next one, please. Finally, new technologies, in one hand, they can exclude, but in the other hand, for younger generations in regions where the access to digital services is more frequent and easy, digital ID, online one-stop shops can really lower the costs, facilitate compliance, give access to public services in areas where there are some logistic challenges, and they should be considered and integrated alongside with the traditional legal reforms. And finally, for small and rural enterprises, what we found out is that it's most common to incorporate agricultural enterprises within the scope of generic simplified legal forms instead of creating a specific legal form for the agricultural sector. Although in Argentina and Brazil, there are some specific benefits for small and rural agricultural enterprises, but since informality is a bigger problem in the rural areas than in urban areas, this should be taken into account by policymakers. They should think also in the rural sector. It's not separated from the urban sector when it comes to MSMEs, and this is a very important topic to be addressed. Next one. And the last one, actually, thank you. I think it was very interesting to look into all the different simplified legal statuses and see that they share many common features. And I believe that they are really important to formalization, and with the evidence, policymakers can build their frameworks to avoid some negative consequences that literature has identified, and they can be very positive to the job generation and to social protection and social inclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. This is a very comprehensive and interesting study. Next, we will turn to Paul, who will be showing us the example of the simplified corporations in Ecuador. Maybe one thing I would like to mention, because I saw a question posted to you, Gabriel, in the Q&A by Kim. So maybe you can put your answer in writing, but I think he raises a very important point. So this is something maybe we can discuss once we've heard from all three speakers. Thank you so much. Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. To begin with, I hope that everything's okay with you and your loved ones. As Tanya mentioned, my name is Paul Nova Velasco, and today, thanks to the kind invitation of the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, I'm going to share with you some data. And I am also going to share with you the main characteristics of the simplified corporations in Ecuador, which have definitely contributed towards the promotion of entrepreneurship, innovation, and business formalization in my country. So without further ado, let's begin with my presentation. Ella, I don't know if you can help me with the next slide, please. To begin with, it is worth mentioning that the Ecuadorian Companies Act was enacted in 1964. And due to its Napoleonic origins, the Ecuadorian Companies Act had established a lot of rigid procedures which discouraged and hindered the formalization and incorporation of businesses. So taking this reality into consideration, the Ecuadorian Parliament enacted the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act in 2020. And among other interesting aspects, the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act established a regulation of the simplified corporations. Could you please help me with the next slide, Ella? So taking these aspects into consideration, which are the main characteristics of the simplified corporations in Ecuador? According to the procedures and according to the framework established by the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act, the Ecuadorian simplified corporations, or sociedades por acciones simplificadas, as we call them, are characterized by the two elements you're seeing on this slide. The first one of them is that the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act has facilitated business registration by eliminating entry barriers with the intention of promoting entrepreneurship and innovation. And the second characteristic is that the Ecuadorian simplified corporations provide greater flexibility to investors and shareholders, allowing them to organize the internal affairs of the company according to their operational requirements and necessities, right? So concerning the first characteristic, and could you please, Ella, pass to the next slide, please? Concerning the first characteristic, the elimination of entry barriers, as I mentioned before, the Ecuadorian legislation has established a regime which facilitates business registration and facilitates incorporation proceedings. So nowadays, any entrepreneur, any business person, any investor who wants to formalize their business can do it without having to pay any fees, for example, to an intermediary, such as a lawyer, such as an accountant, or such as a notary public. Noteworthy, the proceedings established for the incorporation of a simplified corporation can be pursued without paying nobody. It's a free of charge proceeding, which has definitely contributed towards the formalization of businesses in Ecuador, as we will see in the next slide. And also, the Ecuadorian Simplified Corporation has established a regime which allows alternative, which provides the alternative to incorporate a company either through electronic or through traditional means. And here in this slide, you're seeing some data collected by the Superintendents of Companies, which, by the way, is the Ecuadorian public agency that regulates, among other aspects, the incorporation, operation, and liquidation proceedings of Ecuadorian companies. And according to the data collected by the Superintendents of Companies, since the enactment of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act in 2020, 39,298 SAS, or simplified corporations, have been incorporated since 2020. And from this total number, 63% of the SAS incorporated in Ecuador have been incorporated through the electronic proceedings, whereas only 37% have been incorporated traditionally or through the traditional way, right? And also on average, 1,300 SAS are incorporated every month. So this data collected by the superintendents clearly demonstrate that the implementation or the enactment of the SAS or simplified regulations has contributed towards the formalization of businesses. Could you please pass to the next slide, Ella? Thank you. Here in this slide, you're also seeing the results of a survey conducted by the superintendents of companies. So when the superintendents collected this data, they also prepared a survey to ask some investors or to ask shareholders or entrepreneurs who have incorporated a SAS, which were the main characteristics or which were the main advantages that this new piece of legislation has established to promote commercial activities. And one of the questions or the main questions that the superintendents asked consulted if those people who incorporated as simplified corporations were formally executing any formal activities before incorporating a SAS. And 66% of the people who participated in the survey responded that they weren't conducting any formal activity, any formal commercial activity before incorporating a simplified corporation. So this data clearly demonstrate that the enactment of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Act has contributed towards the promotion or the formalization of businesses, which perhaps before the recognition of the simplified corporations were conducting or were operating informally. Could you please pass to the next slide, Ella? Thank you so much. Another question asked by the superintendents during the survey consulted which was the main advantage of incorporating a simplified corporation. And 65% of the people who participated on the survey responded that the main advantage is that this proceeding could be conducted without the participation of an intermediary, especially or specifically without a notary public. So as I mentioned before, the simplified corporations can be incorporated in Ecuador without paying any fees, any tax, anything, right, to nobody. So this proceeding, this free of charge proceeding has also been established with the intention of promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, eliminating entry barriers with the intention of achieving these objectives, right? Could you please pass to the next survey, next slide, Ella, sorry? Thanks. Concerning the second characteristic, the regulation of the simplified corporations has established a greater flexibility during incorporation proceedings. So, for example, nowadays, the regulation of the simplified corporations allows the incorporation of a company with a sole shareholder. Said in other words, one-person companies are now recognized in Ecuador. And also, the regulation of the simplified corporations has abolished the minimum capital requirements, which acted as a serious entry barrier for the incorporation of the traditional companies. And also, concerning this characteristic of providing or allowing greater flexibility, the regulation of the simplified corporations allows more contractual freedom, which means that now investors and shareholders have more liberty to establish different corporate governance structures, right? So could you please pass to the next slide? Thank you, Ella. So which has been the impact of the enactment of the SAS regulation in Ecuador concerning these particular elements? According to data collected as well by the superintendents of companies, 55% of the simplified corporations incorporated since 2020 have been incorporated with a single shareholder or by a single shareholder or investor. Also, as we will see in the next slide, around 69% of the simplified corporations incorporated in Ecuador were incorporated with a paid-up capital inferior to $500. So these two results, or these two data, clearly shows and demonstrates that the elimination of entry barriers and that allowing greater flexibility contributes and incentives the formalization of businesses through these new types of business structures, right? Could you please pass to the next slide, Ella? Thank you so much. Also, it is important to take into consideration that according to the Ecuadorian Internal Revenue Service, almost $218 million have been collected by concept of tax payment from the Ecuadorian simplified corporations. So this data clearly demonstrates that the simplified corporations, besides from promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, have also contributed to promote Ecuador's economic growth. So to sum up and to conclude my presentation, could you please, Ella, pass to the next slide? It is worth mentioning that the simplified corporations, or the sociedades por acciones simplificadas, have implemented a simplified corporation regime, and they have provided an alternative or a scheme which facilitates business registration in my country. Also, as I mentioned in my presentation, the simplified corporations have provided greater flexibility to Ecuadorian entrepreneurs and to Ecuadorian business people. And as a conclusion, the simplified corporations in my country, according to the data that I presented in my presentation as well, have promoted entrepreneurship, have promoted innovation, and have promoted Ecuador's economic growth. So with this, I thank you all for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will be glad to respond them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you and Gabriel for sticking to the time allocated to you. So next, we're going to hear from Nerida, who will be talking about the REMPE system in Cabo Verde. Nerida, over to you.
Good morning, Tanya. I think my video is locked by the. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, I am Nelly Forte. I will present the special regime for micro and small enterprises articulated with data that I collected in my master thesis on the theme hemp and the taxation of the informal economy. Next slide, please. This regime was introduced in Cape Verde after a study conducted in 2013 with the participation of ILO and was effectively implemented in 2015. After 8 years, a study to evaluate this regime is commissioned by ILO is concluded. And this regime was effectively implemented, I think I say that, in 2015. This next slide, please. This regime has two main goals: reduce informality to promote decent work, broaden the social security contribution base and the tax base for more equity, and promoting the competitiveness, productivity, formalization, and development of micro and small enterprises because of its importance in common economic development and job creation. Next slide, please. Data from the National Statistics Institute showed that in 2015, there were 30,228 informal units in Cape Verde. 80% of these work in urban areas, 35% work in 80% of these were in urban areas, 35% work in commerce and contribute to 12% of GDP. Regarding formalization and taxes, 61% of them were unwilling to formalize their business and 72% did not pay taxes. In 2019, there were around 11,174 companies in Cape Verde, 80% of them were micro and small companies, 44% were in trade area and employed about 27% of the workers. And 70% of SMEs is a single member firm. The next slide, please. This regime is applied to entities that regularly carry out a commercial and industrial activity, including the provision of service. This regime includes two categories of company: micro enterprises that employs fewer than 5 persons and whose annual turnover does not exceed 5 million escudos, and small enterprises that employs between 6 to 10 persons and whose annual turnover is between 5 to 10 million escudos. It has some activities not covered because of its high-level technicality. Regarding the functioning of the regime, was approved a unified special tax named TEU that replaces VAT, income tax, and social insurance contributions. The tax rate is 4% on quarterly turnover, and 30% of TEU revenues goes to the tax revenue, and 70% goes to the National Institute of Social Security. The next slide, please. This regime provides some incentives to reduce informality and to boost productivity and development of SMEs. To have access to fiscal, parafiscal, and financial incentives, micro and small enterprises must have their tax and their social security obligations in order. To reduce informality, the regime provides the mandatory registration of the employees in the social security and the incentive in the company incorporation, for example, the exemption for payment of emoluments and other charges in the incorporation of the company. To boost productivity and development, there are tax and financial incentives. The tax incentives include the tax rate, 4%, exemption of TEU for micro enterprises that do not exceed the annual turnover of 1 million escudos, and TEU reduction of 30% to 20% in the first 2 years of activity for micro and small companies. After 2 years, they pay the totality of the TEU. The reduction is granted only once. The next slide, please. In the financial incentives, we have two main credit lines: Youth Startup Program, starting in 2017. In this program, the amount of financing is up to 5 million escudos. The state guarantees between 50% to 80% of that amount and subsidize 50% of the interest rates. And the other program is ProCredit program, starting in 2019. One of the objectives is the encourage of transition from the informal to a formal economy. The maximum co-financing is 75% and corresponds to the maximum of 450,000 escudos and can reach to 500,000 escudos for companies promoted by women. The next slide, please. To finish, I want to present some results obtained with the implementation of HEMP between 2016 to 2019. In the first graph, demonstrates that the impact of the business formalization is evident, with the continuous growth of micro and small companies formalized in this regime of about 120% from 2016 to 2019. As for the social benefits, the second graph demonstrated the continuous growth of the hemp companies registered with the Social Security and their workers. The data available in the National Institute of Social Security reports shows that the registration of workers from hemp companies in Social Security has increased considerably, with a growth rate of 281% from 2016 to 2019. Next slide, please. About the tax benefits, in 2019, 134 micro enterprises that did not reach the turnover of 1 million escudos were exempted from paying tax. In the same year, 1,141 micro companies benefited of the TU reduction of 30%, and 306 small companies had a TU reduction of 20%. As for the financial benefits in 2021, 928 micro and small companies benefited from the Youth Startup Program, and 602 benefited from the ProCredit program. Next slide, please. To demonstrate some of productivity of the micro and small companies, I use the turnover indicator, where the graph shows a growth of about 38% of turnover declared in the tax authority by them from 2016 to 2019. I could not finish the presentation without presenting some data about the revenue collected in the TEU that appears in the last graph. So we see that the revenues collected in TEU have increased over the years 2016 to 2019. In 2016, about 259 million escudos were paid by taxpayers classified under HEMP. In 2019, this amount reached to 521 million escudos, about 76% more than what was charged in 2016. To finish, I want to say that in the last slide, please. I want to finish, last slide, please. Okay, thank you. I want to finish, I want to say that this regime has undergone some changes to a view to its better application, but it needs some improvements. So in my opinion, this can be done with application of the economic benefits provided in the regime that until now is not applied. For example, in public procurement, they must allocate at least 25% of their budgets to acquisition of goods and services in micro and small companies. This will help in productivity. And there is an annual inspection plan for HEMP taxpayers, but the inspection must be reinforced and carried out in an integrated manner by the tax authority and the National Institute of Social Security to prevent tax evasion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nerida. This is a very encouraging, these are very encouraging results. So first of all, I would like to thank the speakers for these three presentations. So before we kick off the Q&A, I wonder if I could ask our speakers to turn on their cameras so that the audience can see them. I also saw that we have very interesting questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So I welcome actually interventions from all speakers regarding these important topics that are being raised in the questions. So maybe we'll start. Gabriel, I saw that you answered already the question on the sustainability of formalization. So what are the benefits? And you mentioned very interesting results from the Simples in Brazil. So maybe if you want to say a few words about that. Because I think that's also always a concern when it comes to the long-term benefits for businesses. So which businesses are more likely to respond to these simplified statuses, and how sustainable their impact or their benefit is on the private sector and on SMEs. So Gabriel, maybe over to you to highlight some of the data that we have found in the Simples regime.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks, Kim, for the question and the feedback about the study. Kim asked me if we found out any impact studies highlighting the sustainability of the formalization in the long term, which means basically if well, maybe the regimes can be successful to foster new registrations, but do these companies survive on the long run? This is a very interesting topic. There are some studies in Brazil. I didn't do this study, Kim, but I will be glad to share it with you if you want. It's in Portuguese, but I guess it's not that hard to translate it. But specifically in the Brazilian case, which is many studies have been undertaken to try to assess the long-term impact on formalization. One study conducted by the Brazilian MSME agency found out that after 2 years, they checked if the company was still operating the enterprise, and companies under the simplest regime had an 83% survival rate versus 38% of the companies under the general regime. So this could be an evidence that they benefit more, but as I mentioned too in the answer, there are mixed findings about this in the literature, specifically about in the Argentine and Brazilian regime. Some authors have argued that the impacts are more localized between the years when the regime change was implemented, but I don't think the evidence is strong enough that it can be generalized for all the cases, all the countries, and this is definitely something that deserves to be studied with detail. And as for the second question, I believe Kim wanted to know if, in our opinion, which kind of company benefits the most from the simplified legal forms, the micro ones, the really small ones, or the small and medium-sized companies. We focused more on the micro and small in this study, and in my opinion, the micro are the ones that benefit the most because of the economies of scale, the business grow, and the amount of revenue necessary to comply with the regulations, with tax, etc., becomes smaller as the company grows. But still, on the other hand, even with the very simple regimes with really low contributions, there are still millions of people working under informality. So I think a big challenge here is to, well, maybe a part of the entrepreneurs were covered, but there are still millions of people working informally in developing countries. So what else do we need to do to reach those entrepreneurs that maybe are even less structured than the micro ones? So this is a big challenge to be addressed. And I want to make clear that the simplified legal forms are not a silver bullet against informality, but they are surely can be one of the tools among with other policies that can help to tackle this issue.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Nelida, Paul, anything you want to add on this?
I think Gabriel's response was super clear.
Perfect, thanks. Another question that came up from the chat is on job creation and the impact on having better quality jobs. So Paul, you actually highlighted some of the impact on jobs in your presentation, but maybe given that the SAS in Ecuador, there's more data on the impact of this reform, if you want to elaborate a bit more. I know that from a recent evidence, there's more than 25,000 jobs that were created, but if you want to elaborate more, not only on the job creation per se, but also on the quality of the jobs that are being created and whether there's evidence longer term. Thanks.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Tanya. And I'm seeing that Orla Kilkulen asked the questions through the Q&A box. So thank you, Orla, for asking the question. And to respond or to answer the question, I'm gonna highlight some ideas that were prepared by the World Bank, which clearly demonstrate that registered companies benefit also from the legal and financial services provided by courts and commercial banks, and also employees from registered business, for example, from a simplified corporation, can take advantage of social security protections. So this data clearly, or this conclusion clearly demonstrate that whenever investors, shareholders, or people want to formalize or are incentivized to formalize their businesses, they can also be more protected from the security or social security protections established by a particular legislation. And concerning Ecuador, according to the data collected by the superintendents of companies, around 25,000 people or 25,000 employees have been formally registered against before the Ecuadorian Social Security Institute, called Instituto Ecuatoriano de Seguridad Social. So this, how would you say, this data did clearly demonstrate that employees can take advantage of social security protections if people decide to formalize their businesses through these new types of business structures as well. And also, if you allow me, please, Tania, I already responded another question asked by Shumete Velete at the Q&A box. And Shumete asked if there's something we can do to convince people who do not want to be taxed to formalize their businesses. So again, as I mentioned before in my answer, registered business benefit from several aspects, such as the legal and financial services that courts and banks offer to register business. And these services aren't usually available to unregistered businesses as well. So to convince or to encourage people who do not want to be taxed to formalize their businesses, we could say to them that they may have easier access to credit and resources to finance their operational activities. So taking these aspects into consideration, I feel that more people would be encouraged to formalize their businesses through these new types of business structures as well.
Thanks so much, Paul. Maybe, Nelida, one thing, given your role as tax inspector and the fact that we have this question specifically linked to compliance with tax requirements. So if you want to tell us more about the experience in Cabo Verde on what has been, or if there are any complementary measures, because I think that also somewhat links to the question in the chat by Christian, on what other measures, complementary measures, can be used by the government to incentivize these firms or entrepreneurs to formalize. So were we able to see from the evidence, from the literature, some success by coupling these simplified statuses with other complementary measures, be it policy or direct firm support, to be able to promote for the numbers and compliance of entrepreneurs? Thanks. Nelida, you're muted.
Okay, I say that I think in Cape Verde we have benefits enough for formalization in a lot of areas, fiscal, extra-fiscal, financial, economics. So we need, and I think that the benefits is the attract of the regime to formalize business. So what I think in Cape Verde, we must to see the tax revenues because of the distribution of 30% of tax revenue and the distribution of 70% of the social security, because the weight of the TU in the total tax revenue is only 2% to 3%. So we need to see that how to increase the TU revenue. However, this regime is having a positive evolution, increasing the number of formalized companies in Cape Verde, and which contributes to broadening the tax base and of micro and small companies. But we have to think about the using of the regime for the tax evasion. Because we do inspection every year. There are cases detected in the inspection where taxpayers have a turnover more than the 10 million escudos provided in the regime. So only when we carry out the inspection, we detected that, and we carry out the additional assessment of tax, and we also change the regime to another regime that we have, that is organized accounting regime. In my study, for example, I have found that the TEU collected through in 2018 represented around 70% of the TEU revenues. Let me say in another way, the TEU collected in inspections by a tax authority represented 70% of the total of TEU revenue. So we have this to see that the application of the regime and the using of the benefits. In the study conducted by ILO now in this year, the consultants say that we have to use this regime, and the benefits we have to be applied only for 3 years. This is a way do not use the regime for the tax evasion. On the other hand, much of citizens benefits from social security. This is a good thing because we have they can access to the health system and to do the system retirement.
Thanks so much, Nerida. That was very helpful, and I hope it answered the question. Maybe one thing I wanted to do is to go back to the question by Shumete in Ethiopia, and on how do I convince people who don't want to be taxed. And that's not only an issue for for the simplified legal status. It's more general to any intervention on informality. And what we have seen from evidence, be it in this study, but also in previous studies on the topic of informality and formalization that were produced by the Business Environment Working Group and by international organizations, is that there needs to be a differentiation between the typology of informal firms, right? And the policy, there needs to be some policy targeting. So we need to look at the capacity of the firms to formalize in addition to the owners or like the firm's willingness to formalize. So there are these two criteria that need to be taken into account by policymakers when they there is, like a decision on what interventions or what policies to adopt. And then these policies need to be targeted to the specific cluster of firms, depending on their willingness to formalize, but also on their capacity to formalize as well. So this is something to take into account when trying to design interventions for formalization. Next, we have a question by Edward on the digitalization. And I actually had the same thought, and I think, Gabriel, you mentioned it as one of the challenges in your study on the risk that comes with exclusion of entrepreneurs that have less access to digital technologies. For instance, when we make digital taxation mandatory for business registration, wouldn't that lead to more disparity between the entrepreneurs that have access and the ones who don't? And how can this be addressed? So maybe, Gabriel, back to you, and then, of course, Nerida and Paul, feel free to jump in.
Yes, Tanya, as I mentioned during my presentation, I think the digitalization can be very promising and reduce transaction costs, but Of course, as Edward mentioned, it can be it can exclude people that don't have access to good quality internet, to mobile services. I believe that this can be challenging for some regions in countries in which have challenges for logistics. It can be a generational challenge as well, right? We know that younger generations usually are more familiar with technology, etc. But older people, elders, are also a target group for some entrepreneurship policy. So usually, I think a good advice is to having online registration procedures, etc., is and tax payment procedures is always it can help a lot, but making it the only way to fulfill the obligation, the registration can create barriers for formality to certain groups. So I would consider the level of digitalization and access before considering implementing an online-only procedure, either for business registration or taxation. I believe in the SaaS example that Paul talked about, there is still the possibility to do it in person and not online only, although the online form is probably the most used. So maybe this could be an approach until the digitalization and the training to use the digital tools and to have the digital skills is widely available. This in-person methods should also be an option for entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. So Paul, Nedida, in case you want to add anything before we go to the next question by Andre.
Okay. I just want to say that in Cape Verde, the tax statement is already made online, but have some problems with the micro and small enterprises that do not have the access to the digitalization. So they have to pay someone to do that statement. But we have already the obligation to submit the statement of TEU online.
Okay, I think it's specifically in the case of Cabo Verde, it's particularly helpful given also the fragmentation of the market, correct? Given that you have the different islands and
yes.
So it does reduce the compliance cost on businesses.
Yes. In some islands it is more difficult because in some islands we don't have electricity, so it's more difficult to have access to the internet too.
Exactly. Paul?
Yes, thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Edward, for the question. And as I mentioned in my presentation, Ecuador implemented an alternative to incorporate a simplified corporation either through electronic or traditional means. And this alternative has allowed people who are not digital literate to, for example, formalize or incorporate a business through the traditional way. And also this alternative has allowed digital literate people or people who do not live in the main urban areas to incorporate a business without having the necessity to travel to physically do or conduct these incorporation proceedings. So this alternative has undoubtedly contributed towards the promotion of business formalization, even in excluded areas where companies weren't traditionally incorporated or formalized. And noteworthy, according to the data collected by the superintendents of companies, in Ecuador, 63% of companies have been incorporated through electronic means or through electronic proceedings. So in my opinion, it is better, or it is a more adequate approach to establish an alternative instead of imposing an obligation to conduct an incorporation either through electronic ways as it's required by the Mexican law, or either through only the traditional ways. So these alternatives may allow more formalization and more incorporations all around the country as well.
Thank you so much, Paul. Andre is asking, in weak states, have we seen any evidence on the impact of such statuses? Maybe before I turn to the panelists, I want to just point Andre to a recent study that the Business Environment Working Group published on not specifically on the simplified legal statuses, but on how do countries deal with informality, fragile countries in particular. So fragile and conflict countries deal with informality, and the study was published and can be explored on the Business Environment Working Group website. I think given the particularity and the fragility of the context in and the different, like typologies of informal activity in these countries, the policy interventions need to be more targeted towards, weighing a balance between addressing, supporting the informal sector, promoting formalization, but also taking into account other failures such as weak governance, weak rule of law, elite capture. Very often these are coupled with lack of digitalization. There is a number of recommendations and findings in the study, but Gabriel, maybe if you want to highlight, in case, do we have any evidence in the study that you presented on any impact or even on simplified legal statuses in weaker states or less developed economies?
Well, Tanya, the focus, as Andre mentioned, was in middle income countries, let's say, developing countries. As for regimes like Simples and Rampa or Monotributo, we don't have any evidence, but I believe, and maybe Paul could help us, that the SAS model was implemented in different countries in Latin America, including maybe some countries in Central America that would fall in the under Andres' definition of low development countries and weak states. And I think the degree of success of the SAS has varied among the countries, considering to which extent they have implemented the full model or only parts of it, and maybe some of this could have a relation with the strength of the state, let's say, like that. Can you share any insights on that with us, Paul?
Sure. I don't know if you, Tanya, allow me to elaborate more on Gabriel's remarks.
Yes.
Several Latin American countries have implemented the simplified corporations form, right? Including Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Mexico. Having said that, it is worth mentioning that registered companies, to answer Andres' question, can benefit from legal services offered by the state, as I mentioned before, and as also the World Bank has said as well. For example, registered companies can benefit themselves from court rulings. So business formalization can also provide more certainty to conflict resolution. And also business formalization could protect investors by the recognition of the limited liability principle. Whereas if someone conducts a business informally, their personal property is exposed to the risk of insolvency. So another aspects that could be included in the analysis, besides or beyond tax reforms or tax benefits, could be this encouragement of the recognition of the limited liability principle to promote more formalization, and also the access to services, either legal, either contractual, either financial, to obtain more protection and to allow businesses to operate more expediently and more adequately inside an economy.
Thank you both. The next question is from Sylvia, whether there are any studies assessing the fiscal cost of these regimes. She's referring, for instance, to the cost in Brazil of the Simplest program, whether we have evidence on what is the fiscal cost to governments to implement such regimes. Maybe Nelida, also you have anything on the REMPE, and then do the benefits outweigh the cost if we're looking at it from the government's perspective?
Now, we don't have evidence about the fiscal costs, but like I said before, in the sense of the tax revenue, 70% to national security, the TU revenue is only 30%. In this sense, tax revenue turn out to be marginal compared to the administrative and litigation costs, for example, the management of the inspection costs. So I think that it's why not only the tax authority have to control this regime and the requirements to be in this regime, but the national security have to do that too, in an integrated manner to have more results in the TU collection.
Thanks, Nelida. Gabriel, anything we have to highlight from Brazil?
Yes, Sylvia, every year the Brazilian tax authorities publish a report estimating the fiscal impact of the Simples regime in terms of tax collection, etc. But this is not, this is a hot topic between academics and the government. And right now, Brazil is undergoing tax reform, big tax reform discussion. And the Simples is often mentioned as one of the big tax expenditures of the Brazilian government, but I have seen academics that use the official data to calculate the real tax expenditure, and they estimated it was just 30% of what the government had forecast initially. So even the method to calculate this impact is not consensus, but yes, there is definitely an impact, and the same could be said for the impact to the long-term sustainability of social security systems, and some studies have shown that there is a potentially big impact in Brazil and Argentina as well. And as for the second part of the question, if the benefits of formalization outweigh the costs, I believe that this is also a challenging question, because there are many direct and indirect benefits. And right now, the work that is being done is to clarify what the objectives are and to start measuring if they are being reached. And so I think it will be easier, at least in the Brazilian case, to assess if the formalization benefits outweigh the costs. But I do think that even though some of the regimes might need reform, it would be, I think, if governments decided just to end or eliminate them, the impacts to informality would be huge. You know, some surveys in Brazil, at least, have shown that if companies didn't benefit from such regimes, a big portion, maybe even half, would consider moving back to informality or closing their operations. So, but this is a very important discussion, but it's not easy to accurately measure the costs and the benefits. So this is the challenge here, the big challenge.
Thanks, Gabriel. And then maybe I'll turn to the last question in the chat before I open the floor. I see Andre's hand is up, and Judith also from the ILO. So the last question in the chat is from Abdelaziz, who's referring to incentives other than the simplified legal statuses. And he's saying that entrepreneurs require other incentives also to formalize. And he's referring to examples such as access to finance, access to equipment, and whether the speakers believe that this incentive may be more effective to motivate entrepreneurs to formalize by promoting their productivity, the productivity of businesses. So maybe Paul, if you wanna, if you wanna start by mentioning this, by responding to this, and then I'll also invite Nelida and Gabriel to respond. One thing I just want to say, maybe before I turn to the speakers, is that in a recent literature review that we have published, what we have seen is that usually a lot of these interventions are more effective when the policymakers adopt a multidimensional approach. So looking at the issue of informality from a more holistic approach, of course, it will have more impact on fiscal impacts, and then on the public budget, but the effectiveness of these approaches is usually increased when these incentives are coupled with legal and regulatory reforms, such as enacting simplified legal forms. But maybe over to you, Paul, and then also Nelida and Gabriel, I invite you to share any insight you may have on this.
Great, thank you, Tanya. And super quickly, in my opinion, if people, entrepreneurs, investors formalize their businesses, they are going to have more access to resources to finance their operational activities. So, for example, debt capital or lending would be an important way for SMEs to expand their access to resources to cover their operational necessities and requirements. So I agree that beyond simplifying business registration and beyond establishing simplified tax regimes, it would be useful to take into consideration these other aspects, such as access to finance and equipment. And I completely agree with Abdul and his question, because this access to more resources can also motivate entrepreneurs to formalize their operational activities as well. Here in Ecuador, we have had some experience concerning the simplified corporations, and also the superintendents has showed that more or less 1,000 SAS or 1,000 simplified corporations have had access to formalize lending or credit requirements to commercial banks. And these people or these entrepreneurs who were acting or operating informally didn't have the opportunity to ask or to request to these finance alternatives when they were formalizing their businesses. So these requirements or these alternatives, clearly demonstrates that people who formalize their operational activities have more access to finance. And in my opinion, that increased access to finance can motivate them to formalize their businesses as well.
Thank you, Paul. Nelida, anything to add? Or Gabriel?
Okay. About the benefits, I think that these really attract the informal actors, because I think that the informal actors only will be interested in formalizing their business if there are some advantages from it. Thus, I think in Cape Verde, the simplification and the reduction of cost of incorporation the company have been relevant for that. And the tax rate for 4% and the reduction in the TEU and the exemption of the TEU, I think is clearly a powerful attraction of this regime. And we see that this regime have good good perception in the actors, and this regime contribute to formalize the existing business too, and to create another business, for example, self-employment. And in the study, I want to say that the formalizing in this regime, it was so good, because in the study carried out now in this year from ILO, is noted that the hemp companies surveys, 35% of them work in informality before they join to the hemp. So I think that the incentives is attracts to the regime, and it it have good results so far. I think so.
That's great, Nelida. So I see that Andre lowered his hand, so maybe I'll go to Judith from the ILO. I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tanya. To come back to Sylvia's question about, let's say, the costs and the benefits at state level, I think this links back to what Gabrielle and also Nelina spoke about. What are the objectives of the regime, right? So you can look at the objective from a very financial point of view, you know, how much does the government spend and how much money is coming in. But then in the longer run, you would assume that enterprises also are able to grow, because when they formalize, they can get access to finance, new business opportunities. So it contributes to growth of the economy, which indeed is difficult to measure. But also we see that some countries, they really take the point of view that people are earning a living in these micro and small enterprises. They create jobs, they generate income. So this means that there's less burden on the state to provide a, let's say, a safety net and make expenses so that these people can, whatever, you know, make a living, have some degree of protection. So less burden on the state when these enterprises grow. And maybe also to link this to the, let's say, if we remember in Tunisia, there was the Arab Spring, which erupted in the informal sector. So the issue of inequality and vulnerability is also a link that I see with the other webinar that we had about fragilities. So this is indeed not easy to measure, but these are all objectives that governments have or could have when they have these types of simplified regimes with incentives attached.
Thank you so much, Judith. This is very helpful and actually a very nice note to conclude the conversation about that. You know, policymakers should not only look at the economic benefit or like the economic cost benefit ratio, but also look at broader objectives such as social objectives and then inequality. We don't have any more questions that have been unanswered. So maybe to conclude, I can summarize the discussion by distilling three main key takeaways from each of our speakers today. So as we heard from Gabriel, the three main key takeaways from the study is that simplified legal statuses have the potential to encourage formalization by simplifying business registration, facilitating tax compliance, and thereby they have the capacity to promote entrepreneurship, economic growth, and job creation. And there is evidence from a number of countries to show that. That said, they come also with few disclaimers. So policymakers should be carefully designing and monitoring the special legal statuses by considering trade-offs, payment capacities, and preventing the misuse of incentives to effectively reduce informality and achieve the policy objectives that are intended with these statuses. The third takeaway from Gabriel's presentation is that providing additional support, such as integrated social security benefits and access to finance, which links to some of the questions that we received from the audience, will enhance the success of simplified legal regimes in reducing informality and supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises by granting them access to the needed resources and the safety nets for operating, not only operating, but also expanding their business and remaining in the formal economy. From Ecuador, also three key takeaways that were highlighted by Paul is that the Ecuadorian Simplified Corporation has led to tangible impact in promoting entrepreneurship and innovation in Ecuador. Due to the advantages, simplified corporations are now the most used business structure in the country, and the impact and the results on the number of businesses registered and jobs creations are there to attest that. The Ecuadorian Simplified Corporation prioritizes contractual freedom over imperative regulations. So the benefit goes beyond simplifying the business registration, but it also extends to the business operation level. And then from the RAMPE case study in Cabo Verde, the three key takeaways is that the simplified regime was specifically designed and aimed at transitioning informal businesses to the formal economy by recognizing the importance that these micro and small companies play in the economy, and not only in the economic context of the country, but also in the social context. And then to achieve these objectives, the REMPA regime proposes not only fiscal, but also fiscal, extra-fiscal, financial, and economic benefits. And then finally, in spite of being a fiscal regime, it's clear that in addition to raising revenue, the government aimed to guarantee access to social security for the citizens who did not benefit from that. So it was really a mechanism not only to provide fiscal incentive, but also to support the smaller and less advantaged enterprises. So to conclude this webinar, I'd like to thank our speakers today and the audience for a very engaged Q&A. And I hope you found our discussion to be interesting and useful. As you know, time is never our friend when it comes to discussing important topics such as formalization, but we hope you'll have a chance to consult the study, which will be available on the website very soon. I also would like to acknowledge the efforts of Ella Duffy from the Business Environment Working Group Secretariat, who's in the background and without who our webinar would not have run smoothly. She has been able to facilitate the full panel interventions. So thank you so much, Ella, and the broader Secretariat colleagues. For those of you in Europe and in Africa, I wish you a good rest of the day. And then for the ones on the East Coast, like me, I wish you a great day. So thank you so much. And thank you again to our speakers and audience, and have a good rest of the week. Bye.